We see some countries and we say that they are advanced and developed. We also see some countries that we say that they are lagging behind in development, or in the process of development, to the rest, and becoming powerful at the level of the great powers of the world. They have a very interesting story. One of the most famous of these is Japan. Japan has a very important part in its history. That begins about 150 years ago, and Japan enters a 50-year period called the Meiji Reforms period. In almost 50 years, Japan has turned from a completely backward country in terms of technology and development into a world power, with the ability to play a role in world wars. This video very briefly tells the story of Japan in those 50 years. The story of the Meiji Reforms was the name of the empire. Reforms and changes happened during his time, but it wasn't like he woke up one morning and said it's time for reforms. In fact, these changes were applied to Japan from outside, and the Americans were also the cause and founder of it. An American man named Matthew Perry. Is Matthew Perry? Who is Matthew Perry? Half of the 19th century, 1853. Matthew Perry is a commander in the U.S. Navy, who before coming to Japan went to Africa to fight against slavery, to prevent slavery, fought there, and participated in the Mexican War. Russia offered him to join our navy, he did not accept. In America, he is also called Father of the Steam Navy. And his title is not unrelated to the story of the beginning of our story. America needed coal to fuel its ships, and one of the things that drew them was the same story. In the middle of the 19th century, in 1853, the American fleet under the command of Matthew Perry reached the shores of Japan. And on the surface, he had a very specific request. He had come and said either let's make a deal or fight. This is the historical moment that led to the emergence of modern Japan. Later, what he is doing is what they call gunboat diplomacy. It means that in the 19th century, the imperialist powers could not do this. Their soldiers, who were much more than the others, would go by ship to the border of a country. They would show their balls and show their arms, and by intimidation they would be forced to take their seats. There are many. There had been an opium war in China, and the doors of China had been opened for trade with the Westerners and the presence of the Westerners in the region, etc., and this had caused the American ships to come and go, and they needed to refuel. There was also a news that Japan has coal mines and they can refuel from Japanese ports. It was another matter, of course, that it attracted the attention of Americans to Japan. To use oil, whale oil was also a very important commodity. That's why Americans, like many others, were looking for whales. It was one of the things that people used to go to the south of the country, and this caused the American ships that are hunting for whales. It often happens that they get lost because of the weather conditions in the Pacific Ocean and around Japan, or for example, they get caught by Japanese ships in the middle of the sea. The Japanese did not treat them well. Make sure that these whale hunters can also work. Except for these Americans, they know that. It is true that for 2 centuries the shogun has closed the doors of Japan, telling the Japanese that no one can leave. No one can come, we do not trade, but it is not completely closed. The Japanese do trade with the Dutch. They do. In fact, some people say that the door was closed to the Spanish and Portuguese Catholics, who all wanted to spread Christianity. With the Protestant Christians, including the Netherlands, and to some extent they maintained a relationship. With badminton, billiards, tomatoes, chocolate, etc. Through this relationship with the Dutch, they had a limited relationship with the Dutch, then when they wanted to kill the Catholic Christians. In the Netherlands, they helped the shogun, and in short, they kept the trade route of the Dutch with the Japanese open for a little bit, so maybe America too. Thinking that we are Protestants and can go there and spread Christianity if we want to spread Protestant Christianity. In short, with a combination of different motivations and different plans, this Mr. Matthew Perry went to the beach of Tokyo or Edo that day. So what happened? A 2-century period of isolation of Japan, the Sakoku period, wants to end like this, a period that started in 1639, and virtually all travel to the West was prohibited, except for 45 families who entrusted all trade with the outside world to them, and their work was limited. And this prohibition was so serious that if Japanese fishermen helped a European boat, for example, they would take the sailor and keep him under house arrest for a while. They would say that you might have received information from the West, that the communication with the outside world is not completely cut off. It is very, very cut off. The little that is completely under their own control. Now after 200 to 250 years it was like this when ferry ships arrived in Japan. The awe of steamships was such that it came to scare the Japanese at all. After the ship itself, the most frightening thing was the cannons that were placed on the ship. And they were pointing towards the Japanese city. Edo Gulf today. I want to be here. In Tokyo. He pointed the 73 balls towards the Japanese soil and fired a few blank shots. He said that I am shooting on the occasion of the American Independence Day and so on, but it was clear what his goal was. The first thing the Japanese did was to say, well, what is the strongest thing we have? These sumo wrestlers. These wrestlers are large Japanese wrestlers, they said that we are more afraid than the fact that we don't have any more. To send them, they will scare them. To send them, and naturally the Americans were not too afraid and said that we have nothing to do with you now, we have a letter from the President of the United States to we will give you this. We will go to you. You should read this. Answer. Later. We will come and get the answer. From you. What are you talking about? But they raised it a little bit and said, sir, look at the ball, look at the awesomeness of the ship and this and the letter that there is no problem and we will take the letter that our territorial integrity will not be called into question and we will take these words and the summary of the letter and read it and see what happens. Later, an answer to it bade him. June 14, 1853 is a very important date. Finally, they let Mr. Matthew Perry get off and give the letter. He gave them the letter and said to read this, "Make up your own mind. I'm leaving. I'll come back in a year. I'll get your answer." He also took some gifts along with the letter. There was a replica of a steam locomotive, telescope, telegraph, wine, and other things. As you can see, we were impressed by them like this. In short, they went back to Taiwan. At that time, it was called Formosa. He saw what a nice island this is. It also has a coal mine. He also wrote a letter to America that this island is very good and if we take it, it will be good for our refueling. And that it will become a power base for us here. But no one seems to have responded to this letter. Doing and seeing that it says yes, open the way of business yen for us Americans. And thinking that it has nothing to do with that ship to come and take everything from us, but we also wrote a law in 1639 that we cannot do business with the Americans. Now this includes it. America would become a law, it would not include that law. What does this look like? This is the appearance of work, paperwork, and administration, and how to fix it. The fact is that someone came with a lot of force. He wants something from you, he says, open the door, sir, and you have to look at it. Did they really have the strength to keep the door closed more than this or not? Who are they? Who is this shogun who is making this decision? This is the highest position, the highest level of samurai, which we explained in another video. Let's just mention here that since the 12th century, the power in Japan has been in the hands of these shoguns, who are making decisions, making policies, and closing Japan. They say that Christianity is coming, samurai values, and the Japanese culture is devouring it. The people tend to turn towards Catholicism and we have to close the door, expel the Christians, and at the same time as the power of the emperor increased, the position of the emperor became less and less commanding. It became a bit of a show. In fact, the power was in the hands of the shogun. The local lords served the shogun. The position of the emperor was inherited. We are talking about the Tokugawa shogunate. The period when the shogun was from the Tokugawa family, almost everything was in their hands to answer this letter, but the shogun said that we should all think together. He actually got help from the emperor, sitting down to talk about a very important issue, and no one wants to take the risk of taking this decision alone. Shish Mahi, they are debating and consulting, and this time Mr. Perry came back. This time with 10 ships and 1,600 people. Earlier than when he said that February came back, his ships came earlier and more. He is putting extra pressure on the shogun and forcing them to respond sooner after the attack that they want to do. It is not possible for the Americans to be able to free the for Japanese ports so that the American ships can go there and do business. This is a very, very important event, Mr. Perry. We will tell his fate at the end of the video. Now let's see how he got a very interesting fate. Now let's see how this story was received in Japan. And how did Japan change after this incident? Because we said that we want to tell the story of Meiji. The whole story is that this gentleman came and made such a request, and the Japanese accepted this request. The Meiji era was different from the era before Meiji in many ways. The decision and acceptance and opening of Japan reached the empire. Before him, Japan was not a unified country. That, for example, its people had a sense of common Japanese nationality for 8,000 years. In fact, Japanese nationality had no special meaning. The armies, the powers, the laws were all local. This is another one later. It was one of the things that changed during the Meiji era. In fact, what happened during the Meiji era? Let's put it this way, the door was opened for the Americans to come. This was one of the coincidences, because when the Americans came, the Europeans also came behind them. Britain came, Germany came, Russia came. Let's make a contract, and now the contracts are not just commercial anymore. We had an example in our own history. It was that if a citizen of our country commits a crime here, the Japanese are not allowed to prosecute. The penal laws of Japan do not include them. And now other privileges. In these negotiations, the Japanese were empty-handed. They just said it was a waste of time, and dragged out the negotiations as long as they could. Then the Europeans did not have a command of the Japanese language and did not even know the geography of Japan. And if they come back, it will take a long time. Their hope was that we should give it a try. Let's get out of their work, learn their technology, get knowledge, for example. Compensate for this military and technological weakness. We should. But the fact is that the distance between the West and Japan during these 200 years of isolation was so great that it was impossible to negotiate with 1 or 2 years. We have to go to war with this Western aggressor now and try to drive it out. And most likely we will fail, or we should make peace with them. Let's strengthen ourselves, and then come to fight with them. These were really questions and forces that each of these thoughts and representing. There became a coup d'état, internal disputes arose. For a while, some samurai said no, we don't accept this method and such words, but in the end, the way of thinking that became dominant and was able to accept itself to others was that we should go on our own. Let's face these internal conflicts. Of course there were many casualties. One of the casualties was that the shogun was removed from power. We said that the person who was sitting on top of him was in fact the emperor's hand. Emperor Motosuhito came to power at the age of 16 after the death of his father and became the previous emperor. Motosuhito, the 122nd emperor of Japan. This is humiliation, and with the support of the emperor and with the support of the emperor, we must come to erase this shame and humiliation. Again, these fights are something else in my opinion. These fights are on the job. These fights are not the main issue. The main issue is that the shogunate system has turned out not to work. He doesn't get over the problems and resigns. The 15th shogun officially resigned and handed over the powers to the emperor. The emperor also officially took all the powers from him, and thus the power of the emperor was regained. Then he made an official statement that yes, we have taken all the powers in our own hands. From now on, we appoint all the officials ourselves, we make all the decisions ourselves. When? 1868. And this is how the power of the empire was established, Mr. Motosuhito's hand. And the name of his period of rule was also named Meiji. Some time later, the same group of advisors also gave an oath to the emperor to read. Later, that text became a kind of Japanese constitution. The starting point of Japan's modernization process. The text of the Charter Oath is a very important text in the history Of Japan, among other things, it says that wherever there is knowledge in the world, we must go and get it in order, to strengthen the foundations of the empire with it. This is an important point. This is really the spirit of what we will do in the next 150 years. Some of it comes from here. Its text was written based on the laws of modern Western governments, especially the Prussian constitution. The Prussian Empire had defended the right to freedom of speech, and it spoke of the right of equality of citizens. The hierarchy that used to have a hierarchical system was collected. We have a goal to improve the condition of Japan, to empower Japan, and everyone should go in this direction and modernize Japan, and follow the example of Western countries. Many things have changed. Many things have changed. Before Meiji, there were emperors who said that during their rule, they were not from the palace. When they came out, the permission to travel was entirely in the hands of the shogun. Many times, the shogun did not allow them to come out, even if they did come out. For example, there was a wheel in the capital. This new emperor, Meiji, came back, but he walked and saw all corners of the country. Then he also gave the people the national spirit to see that we are one country, one emperor, so and so. Then the group of advisors went to check the progress of the Westerners, analyzing a very famous program, Iwakura. Iwakura was a program, it was a mission, a delegation of Japanese went to European countries, American countries, to see what they are doing. They said that our goal is to modernize Japan, the way is to see what these modernized people are doing, let's become a model. Let's build ourselves from it. For example, how is the education system? Let's come and implement the same thing here. Where does the money come from? How do Western governments fight? What are their tools? What are their military tactics? With a world of such questions, how does the West respond to each of these issues? What can Japan do to become strong? And later, when he is strong, how should he sit at the negotiating table and negotiate with them, annul all the contracts that he made in the time of weakness, and make new contracts? And one important thing they have is that they learn these things from the Westerners. They are trying to eat this somehow into their own cultural system. This is also important to them. The text of the Constitution that we said was written by the Germans, not to tell the people that we took it from Germany. For example, we brought it when Emperor Meiji came and said that this is the gift of the emperor to the people of Japan. It really had something in it that was like a gift, because he was saying that every Japanese person can have a military job, hold any government position, can go to serve in the army, can go to serve in the navy. This actually had the fourfold hierarchy that has existed for centuries. Having it would make a difference. Previously, only samurai could be in the military. Now he said no, instead of that, a 4-year conscription for all men. Then 3 years, for example, having a reserve force like this. They made a unified army. They made a modern army. With this law, you could collect taxes. During the shogunate era, there was no tax. Rice was taken from the farmers, and they were given to the shogun. Now, but what is rice? You have to give money. They put the money into the government treasury. Then this constitution was an example of what we said, saying that this is a gift from the emperor. Everything the other thing they took was a way of bringing it into Japanese culture, a model of reformulating Western innovations. Then they combined almost everything, giving it something Japanese. For example, they designed the educational system in a completely Western style and image, but the goal was Japanese. Its purpose was against the Western orientation of the educational system. They said that we should make the Japanese an honest citizen, patriot, servant of the emperor, worthless speck of dust to be sacrificed for the sake of the homeland. This was the idea behind the Japanese educational system. These were the people who had the mission to go and observe these things. Later in the modernization process of Japan, they became very important people. Established one of them. Did not return with the team, stayed in America, later met Roosevelt, played a very effective role as an advisor next to Roosevelt. When they wanted to conclude a peace treaty after the war between Russia and Japan, there was a Japanese who stayed there, and of course it was not the case that all these in this advisory board, they should have a common desire. Everyone should say that we want to become westernized so much. Not that there are some people here who say that we should completely change the script, or we should completely remove Japanese elements and signs from art, music, and painting. We should completely westernize. Be it national music, for a period of time, it went towards Western music, but then in the back and forth, they found a balance point. Maybe it's a topic for another video. But it's very, very interesting. The point of balance is something that should be followed in different things. In the military, before Meiji, we said that there was no national army. When they wanted to create a national army, they said, well, let's go for the war fleet, the navy. Let's follow Britain as an example, let's go to Germany for the ground force, and really do the same thing with their navy at the same time as Britain, develop their ground force like Germany. And then what was left in Japan was the ideology behind this army. That's why their struggle is really shaped. Their resistance, the way the Japanese army participated in the wars, was completely different from other armies, even though the basis and the bricks, the system was arranged by looking at and taking inspiration from these other armies, and then it was their spirit that was different, along with the tactics and technologies that later became their own. Reaching. It led to the point where, in 1895, Japan entered the period of colonization, and colonization started a war with Korea, got involved with Russia, and finally got involved with China, and its success in these wars, especially its success in the war with Russia, and later in the war with China, made the Japanese army gradually feel that it is a world power. And others accept it, especially when I say defeating Russia like that. We also have the video of the war between Russia and Japan. At the end of this era, Japan it had become a powerful country, it attacked China, it was able to take a large part of China's territory. We told a bit of its story in the First World War. And we know that in the Second World War, the image we have of the Japanese, their fighting style, their military spirit, etc. Let's remember that it is under the influence of that organization whose model is Western, but the idea behind it comes from Japanese culture, so there were a series of big changes during the Meiji period, military changes, and a series of industrial changes. Wikipedia has a series of simple tables. For example, how has the length of Japan's railway line changed over the years, the commercial fleet of Japan, coal production in Japan, you see what a strange rate it has grown. Everything in Japan is very interesting. Those 50 years of industrial progress, military progress, and these changes make modern institutions happen. It fell very, very interesting course. For us, why should it be interesting? What should an event that happened 150 years ago in a country in the world really matter to us? In my opinion, there are two important things. One of them is that the Meiji era is the birth of modern Japan. And the other is that it is one of the fastest examples of fundamental change that has happened in the whole world, for a country to change so quickly and so much. Japan was a country, yes, at the end of the world, but it was isolated for 50 years. After that, it was still at the bottom of the world, but it had become a great global power, and then we saw the Second World War, which ended with defeat, and then, after it had failed, it became a powerful industrial country in the second half of the 20th century, which made everything from cars to electronic devices. And the Japanese that we saw there was exported all over the world. He was born in the Meiji era. The changes that Japan made in those 50 years are too many. Sometimes reforms may not be the right word for it. Reconstruction may not be right. Renovation is not important. Sometimes they say that revolution is enough. Rapid growth it was. Both military, power was centralized, it became industrial, leaving many customs and traditions aside. Before that, the Japanese did not have this system of 7 days a week. After the arrival of the Western system, the Western system was taken. It is fasting. Because it is written in the Bible that God created the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. The week also has 7 days and the seventh day is a day of rest. Bringing this to Japan was confusing, and it took a little while for the society to put aside its resistance and accept it. But finally it was accepted and it was done. The scope of Meiji's reforms, renovation, and reconstruction is very wide and deep, and his works were later limited to Japan, Taiwan, Korea, China, the Philippines, and many other places also took this work, but for introduction and familiarity. I think this video is enough for now. We also looked at this issue from another angle when we talked about the summary of The Upheaval book by Jared Diamond. What happened to Mr. Perry? He became an important person in their history. When he came back, the American government gave him $20,000. He gave him a reward. The money now is, for example, close to $600,000. He wrote a detailed book about his observations in the Far East. He played a big role in the recognition of Japan and in the record of Japan. And as we saw in the change of Japan's destiny and the history of Japan, there is now a statue of him in a park named after him in Yokosuka in Japan, the same flag that he had on his ship on that historic day when he first went to the beach of Tokyo. That flag later, the Americans took Japan with them again. When later since World War II, they have been going to sign the Surrender Treaty of Japan and get its signature. In fact, this time it was the flag of an American general named Douglas MacArthur, who had a distant family relationship with Matthew Perry. In another video, we will talk about the life of Matthew Perry. If you like this video, please follow our channel and share it with your friends.